In 1962, To Kill a Mockingbird didn't just make Gregory Peck a household name, it made him a symbol. To millions, he was Atticus Finch, the embodiment of virtue, calmness, and integrity in a world drowning in moral chaos. His gentle eyes, his quiet smile, his unshakable decency, they weren't just acting. People believed that was who he truly was. Hollywood worshipped him. Critics praised him, and the public saw him as the man who had somehow stayed pure in a city built on temptation. But behind that calm, saintly exterior was a man who despised everything Hollywood represented. Gregory Peck, the man the press called Saint Gregory, secretly harbored an obsession, not with fame, not with glory, but with order. He hated chaos, he hated hypocrisy, and more than anything, he hated the arrogance of those who treated cinema like a playground for their egos. In interviews, his words were always measured, but his eyes, those deep, weary eyes, often revealed something else, a quiet rage buried beneath decades of restraint. One night, at a Hollywood dinner party, a young actor asked him, "Mr. Peck, what's the hardest part about working in this town?" Peck paused, swirled his drink, and replied softly, pretending that madness is art. No one at the table laughed. They all knew exactly what he meant, because for Gregory Peck, the madness had names, powerful men, legends in their own right, who tested his patience, insulted his dignity, and revealed a darker, more human side of the Hollywood he had spent his life trying to believe in. And among them, there was one man who nearly broke him, Marlon Brando, the heretic with booze, snakes, and a mind that turned every film set into chaos. Hollywood called it the Dream Factory, a place where beauty was manufactured, love rehearsed, and truth edited to fit the frame. But Gregory Peck learned the truth that few ever survived long enough to see, that every dream born beneath those lights was paid for in silence, in loneliness, and in pieces of the soul. Behind the cameras, there were no heroes, only fragile men pretending to be immortal. He had seen them all, Brando, the genius drowning in his own madness, Sinatra, careless with talent and time, Burton, drunk on his own brilliance, Wayne, blinded by pride, Wells, worshipping chaos, Clift, fading like a fragile ghost, Heston, chasing faith through fame, and Douglas clawing endlessly at a mirror that reflected his envy back at him. Each one had left a mark and a scar, and yet through all of it, Peck remained the same, composed, deliberate, dignified, not because he was flawless, but because he refused to surrender to the darkness that devoured everyone else. He once said quietly to a young actor, "Hollywood doesn't destroy you overnight. It does it slowly, one compromise at a time." Those who met him near the end of his life often described a strange kind of peace about him, as though he had finally stopped fighting the illusions and had accepted that truth in Hollywood was never meant to be loud. It was meant to survive quietly. He knew that for every smile on the red carpet, there was a private sorrow behind the curtain. He knew that every statue, every award was really a tombstone, engraved not with achievement, but with the pieces of one's self left behind. Because in Hollywood, even pain must look beautiful. Even failure must be well lit. Even grief must arrive on cue. And so, when the lights dimmed on Gregory Peck's final years, the world remembered him not for his feuds nor his rivals, but for something much rarer, his restraint. He had lived through chaos, arrogance, vanity, and madness, but never once lost himself to them. He stood still while everyone else burned. And maybe that's what made him unforgettable, because when you strip away the glamour, the fame, the legends, what remains is a single haunting truth. Hollywood was never built to love men like Gregory Peck. It was built to use them, to worship them, and then to bury them under the glitter of its own illusions. They call it the American dream, he once said, his voice barely audible. But if you stand still long enough, you'll realize it's not a dream at all. It's the light blinding you from seeing who you've become. The music fades completely. Only silence remains, the same silence Gregory Peck carried with him until the very end. When the Missouri Breaks began filming in 1976, Gregory Peck believed it might be one of his final great westerns, a film about justice, loyalty, and moral clarity. He couldn't have been more wrong. Before signing the contract, Peck had been reassured by the producers. Brando has changed. He's calmer now, professional. But when the crew arrived in Montana, Peck realized he'd been deceived. Marlon Brando stepped off the plane carrying a suitcase full of liquor, 3 live snakes, and a small toy piano. He called it his emotional energy transfer tool. Every morning, before shooting, Brando would sit in the corner of the set, tapping random notes and muttering to himself, "Today, I'll act using the color blue." To Gregory Peck, a man raised on discipline and preparation, it was unbearable. He whispered to a crew member, "What the hell is he doing?" The man shrugged. "It's emotional connection, I think." Peck's jaw tightened. "It's chaos," he said coldly. "It's not acting." And chaos was exactly what Brando brought. While Peck arrived on set at 7 a.m., script in hand, lines memorized, Brando showed up at 11:30, wearing a wool beanie and carrying a live pigeon. He announced proudly, "This bird will act with me today. I want the audience to feel the friendship between man and freedom." The entire set went silent. When the cameras rolled, Brando didn't deliver a single line correctly. He simply released the pigeon into the sky and stared after it, completely ignoring Gregory Peck, who stood frozen, clutching a script that no longer mattered. That day, Peck didn't speak a word, but everyone could see it. The disappointment in his eyes, the way his hands trembled ever so slightly. A few days later, Brando started whispering his lines so softly that the microphones couldn't pick them up. The sound crew panicked. The director pleaded. Peck finally lost his composure. He turned to Arthur Penn, the director, and said through clenched teeth, "I need to see a psychiatrist." Penn pulled Brando aside, exasperated. "Marlon, this is a film, not an exorcism. Gregory can't keep up with your experiments." Brando just laughed, lit a cigarette, and said, loud enough for Peck to hear, "Then let him try to experience it." That night, in a hotel bar, they sat at opposite ends of the room. Brando, laughing, glass of wine in hand, Peck, silent, unmoving, eyes fixed on his whiskey. They never spoke, but the silence between them was heavier than hatred. Years later, when a journalist asked Brando about Gregory Peck, he smirked. "Greg's like a statue of victory, handsome, cold, and soulless." And when Brando died, someone asked Peck if he felt regret. Peck paused and replied quietly, "No, he deserved it." But Brando's chaos was only the beginning. The next man would test Gregory Peck's patience, not with madness, but with arrogance. Frank Sinatra, the careless star who nearly drove him off the set. By the time Captain Newman, M.D., began production in 1963, Gregory Peck had already earned a reputation as Hollywood's gentleman. punctual. Professional, a man who treated every script like a scripture. But that discipline was about to collide with the one man in Hollywood who played by no rules, Frank Sinatra. Sinatra, at the height of his fame, didn't just command attention. He expected the world to wait for him. And on that set, everyone did. The director, the lighting crew, the camera operators. No one dared challenge old blue eyes, because to defy Frank Sinatra was to invite trouble. Peck would arrive at 6 a.m., costume on, lines ready, eyes steady. Sinatra? He'd stroll in after lunch, sunglasses still on, smelling faintly of whiskey and perfume. The crew whispered nervously, the clock ticking away production hours, but no one said a word, except Gregory Peck. After one particularly late morning, Peck quietly approached the director. "If he's not sober," he said evenly, "I'm quitting this film." Director David Miller looked terrified. "Greg, this is Sinatra, please. Don't provoke him. You don't want to die on this set." For Sinatra, filmmaking was never sacred. It was a game, something to pass time between concerts. During one intense scene, Peck was fully immersed, the emotion raw and real, until Sinatra began whistling. Then he spat on the ground, smirking. Peck froze. Sinatra looked at him and said mockingly, "Sorry, Saint Gregory." Even the crew laughed nervously. An assistant whispered, "He really does look like a priest." Sinatra raised his glass and shouted, "A priest? No, he's Saint Gregory, the most boring saint in Hollywood." That insult, Saint Gregory, would follow Peck for years. The tension peaked during their final dialogue scene. Sinatra arrived 3 hours late, eyes bloodshot, voice slurred. When the director urged him to focus, Sinatra snapped, "I don't need this. I've sung at Caesar's Palace. I know emotion." Peck picked up his script, placed it gently in front of Sinatra, and said quietly, "This isn't a nightclub, Frank. We're acting." Sinatra sneered, downed his drink, and muttered, "Then go make your movie alone." Peck did. He finished his role without once looking Sinatra in the eye again. Even after the film's release, he refused every press conference that included Sinatra's name. Ironically, critics loved the film's tension. One review wrote, "Peck provides control, Sinatra provides chaos. Together, they create electricity." But the truth was far from harmony. Years later, when asked if he'd ever work with Sinatra again, Gregory Peck smiled faintly. "I'd rather act with an empty chair. At least it wouldn't spit in my face." But Peck's trials were far from over, because the next man he would face wasn't drunk or childish. He was brilliant and cruel. Richard Burton. The man Gregory Peck would one day call the most terrible experience of my life. For Gregory Peck, Richard Burton represented everything he despised about fame: arrogance wrapped in genius, brilliance poisoned by ego. Their paths crossed only once, but that single encounter would stay with Peck for the rest of his life. It was a lavish Beverly Hills party, the kind where stars clinked glasses of a scotch beneath chandeliers while whispering rumors between polite smiles. Burton arrived late as usual, drink in hand, his booming Welsh voice cutting through the room like thunder. When the host introduced Gregory Peck as the man who gave the world Atticus Finch, Burton threw his head back and laughed. "Gregory Peck isn't an actor," he said loudly, his words soaked in scotch. "He's a human rights speech in an expensive suit." The room erupted with uneasy laughter. Peck, seated nearby, didn't move. He simply adjusted his tie, a small, dignified act that somehow made Burton look even smaller. But the humiliation didn't end there. at every party that followed, Burton mocked him again and again, calling him Saint Gregory or Hollywood's favorite sermon. Even in interviews, when asked about Peck, Burton would smirk and say, "He acts as if he's giving a speech at the United Nations." By 1965, when both men were offered roles in the same film, the tension had grown legendary. The script was sent to Peck first. He read only a few pages before tossing it onto his desk and saying coldly, "I can work with anyone except an arrogant drunk like him." Within 48 hours, the project was dead. Hollywood whispered that it was Gregory Peck's refusal that killed it. And for the first time in years, Burton's confidence wavered. Later, Burton confessed to a British journalist, "I hated him. I hated Gregory Peck because he reminded me of everything I wasn't. He was perfect, too perfect. He made me feel like a fraud." Then he added, with a bitter laugh, "Every time I see his face, I want to vomit. He's my conscience staring back at me." To Burton, Gregory Peck was living proof that a man could succeed without self-destruction, without the madness, the drinking, the chaos. And that truth burned him from the inside. In 1984, when Richard Burton died, reporters flooded Peck's doorstep. "Do you have anything to say about his passing?" one asked. Peck paused for a long time, then replied softly, "A man like Burton doesn't need me to say anything more." But fate wasn't done with Gregory Peck, because the next rivalry wasn't born from drunken insults or professional jealousy. It came from something much deeper, a clash of beliefs, a battle for the soul of America itself. John Wayne, the patriot who saw Peck as the enemy of everything he stood for. If Marlon Brando was the chaos Gregory Peck despised, and Richard Burton was the arrogance he endured, then John Wayne was something else entirely, his mirror opposite. They weren't just two men, they were two ideologies, two Americas staring each other down. Wayne, the towering symbol of patriotism, saw war as honor and a strength as destiny. Peck, the quiet advocate for peace and civil rights, believed true courage was measured by compassion. To the public, both were heroes, but to each other, they were traitors. Their silent hostility had lingered for years, but it erupted one night in 1971 at a crowded Los Angeles party. Wayne, wearing his signature leather vest, raised his glass and growled loudly enough for the room to hear. "If America were full of people like Gregory Peck, we'd have lost every war we ever fought." Laughter filled the air, sharp, nervous, echoing. At a table in the corner, Peck sat still, his expression unreadable. Then he stood up slowly, turned toward Wayne, and replied, his voice calm but slicing like a blade, "And if America were full of people like you, Duke, we'd never know peace." The laughter died instantly. Two Hollywood giants stood locked in silence. From that moment, the feud became legend. Neither man would attend events where the other was present. When the American Film Institute invited them both to appear on a panel about cinematic heroes, Peck refused flatly. "I won't share a stage with him," he said. Then fate, as cruel as ever, played its hand. In 1970, Universal Studios approached them to co-star in Rooster Cogburn, the sequel to True Grit. The contract was nearly finalized until John Wayne heard Gregory Peck's name. He slammed the script down and roared, "I won't act with that America hater." When Peck heard of it, his response was ice cold. "I'd rather die." Their animosity deepened as Wayne became involved in far-right politics, while Peck gave heartfelt speeches before Congress about justice, equality, and restraint. For 20 years, they never spoke. At the Oscars, if they passed in the same hallway, Wayne would turn his head away, and Peck would stop, adjust his tie, and keep walking, a small, silent act of defiance that spoke louder than words. In Wayne's final years, as he battled cancer, a reporter asked Peck, "Do you plan to visit him?" Peck paused, looked away, and answered softly, "I pray for his soul, but I still can't bear to look at his face." When John Wayne died in 1979, Hollywood mourned. Flags at half-mast, hundreds of stars sent flowers. Gregory Peck did not attend the funeral. He only sent a short letter to the Wayne family. It read simply, "My condolences." And yet, even as the world celebrated Wayne's legacy, Peck felt no victory, only weariness. He once told a friend, "Sometimes it feels like every man I've worked with left a scar on me, but the next one wasn't arrogant, nor cruel, nor political. He was something far more dangerous, a genius without restraint. Orson Welles, the brilliant madman who made Gregory Peck lose control for the first time in his career." If Gregory Peck's life in Hollywood was a test of patience, then working with Orson Welles was his breaking point. The year was 1956, and they were filming Moby Dick. It should have been a masterpiece, a tale of obsession, faith, and the sea. But what happened behind the camera became a nightmare. From the first day, the atmosphere on set felt wrong. Peck arrived early, prepared, costume fitted, eyes sharp with focus. He was ready to embody Captain Ahab, a man consumed by purpose. But 2 hours later, Orson Welles, cast as Father Mapple, was nowhere to be found. When he finally appeared, the air seemed to change. A cloud of cigarette smoke followed him, along with the faint scent of wine. "Ah, the ship sails without me already," he said with a smirk. Director John Huston glared, but Welles only threw his arm around Peck and laughed. "Come now, Gregory, let's not take the ocean too seriously." Peck stiffened, gently removing Welles's arm. From that moment, their energy clashed like waves against rock. Welles refused to follow the script, changing lines on a whim, arguing with Huston over camera angles, and delivering every scene as though he were preaching from the heavens. During the chapel scene, one of the film's most sacred moments, Welles began muttering off script, eyes wild, voice trembling with eerie conviction. "Ahab is not chasing a whale," he whispered. "He's chasing God." The crew watched in a stunned silence. Peck, standing nearby, clenched his fists. When Huston shouted, "Cut!" Welles didn't stop. He stared directly into Peck's eyes and said softly, "You see that? That's madness. You'll never understand it, Gregory. You don't understand anything." For a moment, no one moved. And then Peck, the man known for his calm, felt rage rise like a wave he could no longer suppress. Later, he would confess quietly to a friend, "God forgive me for not punching him." But Welles, ever theatrical, didn't notice. He simply looked up at the ceiling and murmured, "He doesn't even know what madness is. Poor creature." After that day, Peck avoided him completely. He arrived, did his scenes, and left without a word. When the film wrapped, he promised himself never again to work with men who mistook chaos for brilliance. Years later, when asked about Welles, Peck's answer was chillingly calm. "How should I put it?" he said. "He was like a man who fell from heaven and never stopped falling." Welles, for his part, told the story differently. He told the students once, half jokingly, "Gregory Peck was a good man. Too good. I just wanted to see what would happen if I shook his halo a little." But for Gregory Peck, Moby Dick left a scar deeper than critics ever knew. He realized then that genius without integrity was just another form of insanity. Yet of all the men who tested him, there was one who wounded him in silence, a man who said nothing and yet made Gregory Peck feel smaller than ever before. Montgomery Clift, the ghost who made him question his own place in Hollywood. Gregory Peck never said it out loud. He didn't have to. Everyone in Hollywood knew Montgomery Clift terrified him, not because of his talent alone, but because Clift represented something Gregory Peck could never be. In the late 1950s, Clift arrived in Hollywood like a whisper after a storm, fragile, quiet, achingly human. While others shouted their performances, Clift barely spoke. He felt. He carried pain in his eyes, truth in every hesitation, and somehow made silence louder than any line of dialogue. To a man like Gregory Peck, trained, disciplined, deliberate, Clift's raw vulnerability was both mesmerizing and terrifying. In 1960, when director Carl Foreman invited Clift to audition for The Guns of Navarone, the session lasted only 20 minutes. But when it ended, no one could speak. Clift's voice trembled. His eyes glistened. It was as if the character wasn't being acted. It was being lived. Foreman turned to the producers, speechless. Finally, he said, "He's the soul of the film." When the news reached Gregory Peck, who had already been considered for the lead, something inside him cracked. He picked up the phone and called his agent. His voice was quiet but tight. "They're looking for a man completely opposite of me, aren't they?" He didn't say it aloud, but the fear was clear. His time was running out. That night, he attended Clift's test screening. The lights dimmed, the projector hummed, and there on the screen appeared a face so delicate, so haunted, it seemed carved from sorrow itself. Clift wasn't performing, he was bleeding. Every look, every breath carried an unspoken truth. When the lights came back on, Peck didn't move. A colleague turned to him and asked, "Well, what do you think?" Peck's reply was barely a whisper. "He acts with the things that cannot be said." That night, Gregory sat alone in his private screening room. He watched the reel again. And again, the flickering light danced across his face, illuminating a man who suddenly realized that Hollywood had moved on without him. When the projection stopped, his housekeeper entered quietly. Peck was still sitting there, motionless, glass of whiskey untouched. He finally said, almost to himself, "I've just seen the future of Hollywood, and I don't belong in it." It wasn't jealousy that filled him, it was mourning, because Clift represented the death of an era, the end of the heroes carved from a stone, and the birth of actors who bled truth onto the screen. Gregory Peck would never forget that night. It changed him, it humbled him, but Hollywood wouldn't give him time to reflect, because before the wound could heal, another man appeared, not fragile, not sensitive, but confident, loud, and dangerously proud. Charlton Heston, the thief of Ben-Hur's soul, and the man who turned faith into ambition. In the mid-1950s, Gregory Peck was Hollywood's moral compass, the embodiment of integrity, the man whose very presence seemed to elevate a film's soul. So when MGM approached him in 1957 to play Judah Ben-Hur, a role described as the most spiritual journey ever filmed, it felt like destiny. The script landed on his desk, thick as a Bible. Peck read it carefully, pausing when he reached the massive chariot scene, a spectacle written across dozens of pages. He put the script down, exhaled, and said quietly, "I don't want to turn fate into a tool for making money." He declined the role. It 3 months later, that decision would haunt him forever. The studio gave the part to Charlton Heston, a rising star with the build of a warrior and the ego to match. MGM proudly declared, "This is the man who can make audiences believe God exists." When Peck heard the news, he simply muttered, "Hollywood chose the wrong man." It might have ended there, a quiet disagreement between actors, but Heston didn't know how to stay quiet. At a press conference, a reporter asked him how it felt to replace Gregory Peck. Heston chuckled and said, "Faith doesn't need a handsome man like Gregory Peck." The room laughed. And just like that, Heston had crossed the one line Peck never allowed anyone to cross, his faith. When the quote reached Peck, he slammed the newspaper on the floor. "He's playing God without believing in him," he said coldly. From that moment, the feud was set. Peck called Heston a muscular machine that can read lines. Heston dismissed Peck as Hollywood's pope, preaching instead of acting. But fate has a cruel sense of irony. When Ben-Hur premiered in 1959, it wasn't just successful, it was monumental. The film shattered box office records and won 11 Academy Awards, including Best Actor for Charlton Heston. On that Oscar night, Gregory Peck sat in the third row of the theater. When Heston's name was called, the audience erupted in applause. Heston strode to the stage, bathed in golden light. Peck did not clap. He just watched, silent, motionless, his hand gripping his glass so tightly that it cracked. A few days later, he visited the Ben-Hur set. He stood in the shadows, watching Heston atop the chariot, the very image that could have been his. He said nothing. He left before the cameras stopped rolling. An assistant director later recalled, "He left like a man walking away from a funeral." I don't know if it was jealousy or sorrow. Years later, when Ben-Hur celebrated its historic Oscar wins, Heston sent Peck an invitation to the celebration party. Peck didn't attend. He sent back a small envelope instead. Inside was a single piece of paper with 2 words written in ink, "Faith lost." No one except director William Wyler understood its meaning. For Peck, Ben-Hur wasn't just a lost role. It was a symbol of something far deeper. The day Hollywood replaced belief with ambition and art with glory. But even that pain couldn't compare to the storm that came next, because the final man who tested Gregory Peck's soul didn't mock him, didn't insult him, and didn't try to destroy him. He simply wanted to be him. Kirk Douglas, the rival who spent a lifetime trying to outshine him, and in doing so, revealed the tragedy of both men. For nearly 2 decades, Gregory Peck and Kirk Douglas lived like 2 planets locked in the same orbit, always near, never colliding, each burning to prove who shone brighter. But beneath their polished smiles and polite interviews, Hollywood insiders knew their rivalry was venomous. By the late 1940s, Gregory Peck was already an icon, elegant, controlled, a man whose characters reflected ideals America wanted to believe in. Kirk Douglas, meanwhile, was the opposite, raw, impulsive, hungry. He clawed his way to stardom with blood and ambition, his face forever marked by the cleft in his chin, a symbol, some said, of both a strength and defiance. Douglas often mocked Peck behind closed doors. He'd smirk and tell journalists, "Greg just stands there and lets morality do the acting for him." Then, with a flash of his grin, he'd add, "That's why I'm always better." The quote spread across Hollywood like wildfire. Peck didn't respond, not publicly, but friends later said they could see the quiet fury in his eyes whenever Douglas's name was mentioned. The rivalry reached its peak in 1963 at the Academy Awards. Gregory Peck had been nominated for To Kill a Mockingbird, the performance of his lifetime. When his name was called as Best Actor, the entire auditorium rose in applause. In the back row, Kirk Douglas sat with a drink in hand, muttering bitterly, "If he's really Atticus Finch, then why is Hollywood still full of hypocrisy?" People turned to look. Gregory Peck, standing on a stage, heard it, and though he never broke his calm, a flicker of something, pain perhaps, crossed his face. After the ceremony, when a reporter asked him what he thought of Douglas's comment, Peck simply smiled and said, "He likes to show off." But deep down, the wound was real. Douglas built his career on the fire of his rage. Paths of Glory, Spartacus, Lust for Life. Each role was a declaration, raw emotion over restraint, instinct over intellect. In his mind, Gregory Peck represented everything false about Hollywood, a saint carved by public relations, not by truth. When Columbia Pictures later invited both men to co-star in The Heroes of Telemark, 1965, Peck refused immediately. "I won't stand next to a man who acts with his chin and shouting," he said. When Douglas heard that, he exploded. He called Peck the hypocrite with the golden halo and sneered to reporters, "Peck's not a man, he's a brand, a marble statue pretending to have a heartbeat." For the next 2 decades, the Cold War between them never thawed. They attended the same events, posed for the same photographers, but never once looked each other in the eye. Then, in the 1980s, when a journalist asked Kirk Douglas who he thought was the last true star of the Golden Age, Douglas said, with a trembling smile, "Gregory Peck might be a star, but I'm a real human being, and I'd rather be human than an idol built on lies." Gregory Peck never responded. He didn't need to. Time was already answering for both of them. Years later, in 2001, Douglas, now frail and partially paralyzed after a stroke, was asked about their feud. He wept. "Greg, he was the man I envied, scorned, and wanted to be all at once." When reporters told Peck about Douglas's words, he paused, lowered his head, and said softly, "I don't hate him anymore. I just regret that we never understood each other." It was a rare admission of sadness, not pride. 2 men who had spent a lifetime fighting for the same spotlight, only to realize in the end that neither had ever truly seen the other. Their story was more than rivalry. It was the tragedy of 2 exhausted souls, each trying to prove they were real in a city that rewarded illusion. But if Hollywood taught Gregory Peck anything, it was that truth doesn't live in applause. It hides behind the lights, waiting for the cameras to stop rolling. Because beneath the glamour, beneath the endless smiles, there was a darkness few ever dared to name.